I'm Laura Murphy. I'm the chair of the HEAL Research Committee, and I'm very excited to see all of you here. We have a lot of people here today for this exciting conversation I'm thrilled to be able to host. First, I'd like to tell us, would you advance this slide for me? First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about HEAL in case you're new to our community. HEAL, well, first, apparently I'm going to tell you about the ground rules. The slides are not in the order I expected, but that's my fault. So just to let you know, as I said, you'll be on mute. There'll be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please feel free during the process of the presentation and conversation to write your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring them while Lara is giving her conversation or giving her talk. And I will sometimes interrupt her to interject with some of your questions when they're very relevant to the moment. But otherwise, she and I will have a bit of a conversation at the end, guided by your questions. Please give us all patience, lend us your patience as we navigate this technology. I know that we've all grown far too used to these technologies lately, but you know, there's sometimes a glitch, and we appreciate your patience. And sometimes perhaps someone's cat or dog or child or who knows what will enter in the screen, mail lady. That's happened here at my house. Please be aware that we are all working under interesting circumstances. And please respond with respect and generosity for your colleagues, including Lara and also each other. We're here to have a productive conversation and to learn from each other. So I'm really glad that you're all here to do that. Can you advance the slide? So HEAL is a network of professionals across the United States and the world. There are about 3,100 participants in this network who all come together to share an interest in working to eradicate human trafficking. You can move to the next slide. HEAL is based very much on having a public health lens on human trafficking, and we do that through a set of committees. Our structure is committee-based. Right now, you're attending the research committee meeting at which we often discuss the research that's been coming out, the recent research, but we also have an education and training committee, a protocols committee, an advocacy committee, direct services committee, and a media and technology committee. Advance the slide. And that work is all being done around a few guiding principles, which are primarily based around the idea that human trafficking is a public health issue and that we need to address it using a kind of socio-ecological framework that is attendant to social determinants of health and that is concerned about providing a survivor-centered, trauma-informed, evidence-based lens for looking at human trafficking. And so that work means that we work on all forms of human trafficking across all demographics and across the world. And our participants in the network represent researchers and social service providers who are doing a really wide array of extraordinary work all over the world to try to ensure that all trafficked people get access to healthcare that they need and to the other services that they deserve. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you today's speaker. Our speaker today is Lara Gerassi. She is, hang on, I wrote this all down. She is the assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. She works in particular on the health and well-being of people at risk of human trafficking. She's the first author of the book, Sex Trafficking, Commercial Sexual Exploitation, Prevention, Intervention, and Trauma-Informed Practice, which is a book I think that everyone in this group could benefit from purchasing. I like to suggest that people purchase people's hard work, but reading more importantly. And she has done a lot of work in peer-reviewed journals such as Journal of Social Work, Journal of Interpersonal Violence and Violence Against Women. We invited her here today because I think she's doing important work that is much needed and urgent around the way social service provision is consumed and perceived by people who are survivors of trafficking and commercial sex, and people who are engaged in sex work and sex trade. She is, she's, to me, she's someone who's really thoughtful and engaged about her methods. And so in terms of the research committee, the work we want to do is promote more rigorous, more engaged research. And she has a real strong sense of doing community-based research. She's very engaged in having a self-reflexive practice. And she's, her work is incredibly survivor-centered and survivor informed. And so I'm really thrilled to get the chance to learn from her today. And I hope that you all will also appreciate what this conversation we have today. We have an hour, we have 52 minutes now. So let's get all we can out of this, and go ahead and take it away, Lara.
Great, thank you for that really warm and lovely introduction. I'm very, very grateful to be here. And so thank you to Heal and to Lara for inviting me. Truly appreciate it. Before I move forward, can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, okay, great. So, as Lara said, my name is Lara Gerassi. I use she, her pronouns, and it's really my honor to be here and to talk about a little bit about this study that was very, very influential in terms of my thinking and approach of the research, and I like to think was a really helpful stepping stone in the communities in which it was conducted. And so I'm very thrilled to share that with you. So just a little bit of a roadmap for where I see us going for today. I'd like to share with you a little bit about my background that led to this project and a little bit about the lens with which I view the world, but also how that might impact my research. I think that's going to be a thread that I'm going to try and weave in through the rest of the presentation. I'll take a little bit of time to talk about the larger study overview. So the article that was sent out to you all that you may have had a chance to read is one article of a sort of larger study looking at a number of different things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that study. And then the focus of this presentation, as Lara mentioned, is really going to be sort of on the methods of how we came together as a community, what my process was in order to, and then what our process was to conduct this research. And so I'll talk about grounded theory, which was the methodological approach, but then also the community partnerships that were really instrumental, and the instrumental people that really helped to make this study, I think, more relevant, hopefully, to the community and to the field of research as well. I'm going to summarize the findings very, very briefly. There is so much richness that I can't talk about today with the focus on the methods. And so, I hope that if this serves perhaps as an invitation to look at some of the particularly, I use a lot of the narratives in the articles themselves. So the quotes from the women I interviewed, et cetera. And so, I can't integrate that all today, but so I hope that will be an invitation to look at that in the future if you have time, or if you haven't already. And then sort of the processes that resulted from that study. So how we conducted member checking, how we thought about this research to practice. I'm going to share about my reflexivity process and direct you to some other folks who have talked about their reflexivity processes in a different way, but I won't speak for them necessarily. And then, some questions and discussion. So I want to take a moment and share that my lens for which I see the world, and also for the ways that I approach research, is as a white Hispanic researcher. There are many other intersectional identities that I could talk about, and when I teach and do other types of presentations, I do. Given the context of this particular presentation, I think it's really important to share that, I am coming at this as a white Hispanic person. And so what that has meant for me and for others is that the roles of white privilege and, unfortunately, white supremacy are really relevant in my day-to-day actions. And what that has meant is that I have learned, unfortunately, a lot from white supremacist systems and systems that benefit white folks more than other folks of color, particularly Black, Indigenous people of color. And so what that has meant is a real process of unlearning and relearning. And so as I go through this presentation, there are things that I did to try and really integrate the perspectives, particularly of Black or African American women. But, I do need to sort of share that and be upfront with that. I also will use the terms Black and African American interchangeably. I recognize that not all people who identify as Black identify as African American and vice versa, and there are some nuances to that language. The women who I interviewed identified both as Black or African American depending, and so some of them also identified as white. So I just want to share a little bit about that language. Okay, so my sort of personal and professional background that kind of led to and is adding to this lens in which I come to research. So when I think about my career, I think about it in terms of my practice experience as a social worker and a licensed clinical social worker, and then as a researcher. So my experience as a social worker was predominantly in New York City and in St. Louis, Missouri. And I started off working with immigrant communities because I think in part because I'm first generation American. So I did have some connection to some of the communities and with whom I worked. And I speak French fluently and Spanish proficiently. And so that gave me, although my Spanish is now getting rusty, but as an academic, but that gave me access, language access that I think was very important to be able to talk to immigrant communities, some of which in a native language, in their first language. And from that work and doing women's support groups, facilitating women's support groups, I became really interested in sort of the broader issues of gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, et cetera. And that eventually led me to St. Louis, where I worked at Redevelopment Opportunities for Women. So this picture is from me facilitating groups back then about economic abuse, among other forms of intimate partner violence. I learned a lot in this practice experience, and it really, really influenced the ways in which I do research, I think. And so one of the things that brought me to where I am today is that I was hearing about experiences of people involved in mostly women, involved in the sex trade. And I was hearing about sex trafficking in practice, but it wasn't matching, one, the stereotype that I had at the time, and two, I think the landscape of research that we had at the time. So the women who I was serving and who I was working with and who I was hearing some of these stories that were very relevant or sounded like a lot like sex trafficking were USA born women, predominantly in the St. Louis area, which is very racially segregated and is almost 50-50 African American and white, were USA born Black and white women who were experiencing sex trafficking and weren't calling it that. And so that got me really interested in what was it that I was hearing in practice? Were other domestic and sexual violence providers hearing similar type of stories? Were we asking the right questions in practice? Were we offering the right services? And what were even those services landscape? Was this different from intimate partner violence? And so it's with that lens that I went back for my PhD in research, which led me to kind of where I am today. So when I think about my current role, my research and teaching and service, I think all broadly focus on some elements of sex trafficking or people at risk of sex trafficking and some anti-racism, racial injustice work. And so most of my research now focuses on, how some of these intersectional identities, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability status, how some of those identities impact both people's experiences of sex trafficking and then also their experiences accessing and engaging in services. And then I think a lot about identification. Are we asking the right questions? And I think a lot about the social service landscape. So it was with that lens that really brought me to the current study, or the study that I'm going to be talking about today. And so before I go any further in talking about the study, there are some people that I really need to thank. First and foremost, the research participants, who I will tell you a little bit about, but I interviewed 30 women with experiences of sex trading as adults and 20 service providers, and each of them shared their time, their resources, their wisdom, their lived experience, their expertise, and I'm truly grateful. And obviously, I wouldn't be sitting here without them, so I'm very grateful. I had two really important community partners, one which was a coalition against trafficking and exploitation. So this was an umbrella group of a number of different organizations coming together to say, we know that sex trafficking is happening, or human trafficking, is happening in our communities. And so, let's figure out how to do something about that. and a substance use treatment center. Amanda Colgrove and Deanna Kopriva McPherson, who I'll talk about in a minute, were both very instrumental as well as Abby Howard. And then, of course, the funding for this study is always helpful. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today is really the methods. And so I'm really talking a lot from this article that Amanda, Deanna, and I co-wrote. And I think it's really important to reference this article in part because part of what I'm going to do today is to share about my reflections and my reflexivity processes as a researcher and as a white Hispanic researcher. But I co-wrote this article in which their reflections also appear. And so Amanda, who was at the time the coalition organizer, who identifies as white, and Deanna, who was the head of the committee that addressed service provision of the coalition, among the many other hats that she wore at the time, identifies as African American. And so we came together to write this article. And so although I'll talk a little bit about my reflections, I hope that you might be interested in some of the other reflections that Amanda and Deanna provided. Okay, so this study took place in the St. Louis area. And so at the time, the data collection mostly took place in 2016 and 2017. So this was, of course, an interesting time in St. Louis in terms of history. So in 2014, Michael Brown was murdered by Darrell Wilson, a white police officer. And of course, there was a resulting conversation that wasn't necessarily new about the sort of challenges of racism and white supremacy, but certainly there was a different chapter that happened, at least I would say, at the time. And so from from Michael Brown's death that happened in 2014, then led to lots of different initiatives that were sort of addressing St. Louis community and racism. So really understanding what I think a lot of people of color in the community knew already, which is that there's a very racially divided and very problematically racist community, as a lot of communities are experiencing. So while I think there was a lot of mirroring to what is going on today in the present moment, I think that there were certainly some differences. And so thinking about how this data collection and this study did not happen in isolation of everything else in the context going on around that. And I mention that because I think it's important for those of us who are doing research on this call to really be thinking about what is the current context, what is the current moment, and how is that impacting my research? And so that was a very big piece for this particular study. Excuse me. So in coming to the research aims, there were a number of things that impacted how we got to the point of asking the questions that we asked. And so, of course, there was my practice experience and sort of the things I've already shared with you. There was, of course, the literature on a national level that was getting to be more and more, I think, diversified in terms of understanding what sex trafficking specifically, human trafficking too, but sex trafficking specifically looks like in the US and in different parts of the US. And then there was some prior work that I had done with the coalition and some research to sort of address some of the tensions that were happening in the coalition. And so I think there was a lot of that prior work that went into this. We also came to these research questions because of these coalition meetings. So these bringing together of all these providers who were interested in doing something about human trafficking in the community. And for me, my observations of and participations in this discussion. So there were a number of disagreements in the coalitions around the approaches to do some of the work that impacted my sort of question of, what was going on at the time. And there was a lot of conversation around who was present at the table and who was missing. The providers at the table tended to be white, tended to be in organizations that served white cisgender women. And so there were a lot of conversations about, gaps in the LGBTQ community and gaps in racially diverse, community leaders, bringing in, perhaps other social service providers that were with more diversity and or other different types of community leaders that weren't formal social services, but other community leaders, churches, et cetera. And so definitely some tensions in different approaches. The other thing that sort of led us to these questions were the discussions with and sort of informal conversations with other service providers, with people with lived experiences, and or those who identify as survivors. I'm using that language purposely because sometimes there are folks who have lived experiences and who don't necessarily identify as survivors, and sometimes there are survivors where that survivor identity is really, really central. And so having conversations with some of these points all are impacting sort of the thinking that's going on. And then I was really, really fortunate enough, I think in part because of the relationships that I built as a social service provider myself before I went back for research, to have this service provider subcommittee of the Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation, led by Deanna, who I mentioned earlier, who really believed in the research that we were doing together as a community. And so this study became a standing agenda item for us to discuss, and as I'll mention throughout, was really instrumental in the methods, in analyzing the data, in figuring out next steps, and in figuring out how we were going to create changes based on some of the findings. In retrospect, I think a lot about how that group, although having some racial diversity, was still a predominantly white group. It is very reflective of the social service landscape in St. Louis, which is a predominantly white, in which service providers are predominantly white. But in retrospect, I wish that I had, or something that I think about a lot in moving forward, and some of the research I do, is thinking about, because race is so central to some of these different pieces, thinking about purposely diversifying those groups in a way and bringing together. And so, part of what I want to share with you today is the things that I think really help to benefit this study. Part of the things I want to share with you today are the things that I learned and or that I wish I had done differently, or wish or moving forward, do differently or think differently about. And this is one of those things. So the study aims that we came to were very, very broad, which is pretty consistent with grounded theory methodology that I'll talk about in a minute. So the first aim was to understand how adult women who trade sex or who have some type of sex trading experiences as adults identify their sex trading experiences. So do they identify as sex trafficking or sex trafficking victims, as prostitutes, as sex traders, as sex workers? What is sort of the language that they use? How is it that they identify their own experiences? We have a lot of academic literature about this, but I was really interested in, and some about women as well, or folks who had engaged in the sex trade broadly, but that was one piece that was really interesting to me about this study. And two was to identify the perceived barriers and facilitators to serve social service access and engagement. So what helps women engage in services, access and engage, and what dissuades them or creates a barrier. And the emerging themes from particularly this second aim is really the bulk of the content that was in the article that was disseminated or that was sent out on the listserv about experiences of racial tensions, et cetera, and is the focus of what we'll talk about today. All right. Lara, any questions so far?
Not yet. We're good.
Great.
Keep rolling.
All righty. So this study, as I mentioned, used a grounded theory approach. And so what grounded theory is the method of conducting qualitative research that focuses on creating conceptual frameworks or theories through building inductive analysis from the data. So I was collecting data. We were inductively analyzing. We were sort of trying to understand what was emerging from those very broad research questions, and with the ultimate goal of creating a model or a conceptual framework that I'll share with you at the end, or not at the end, but in part of the conversation. There are a number of different approaches to grounded theory studies. This study used Kathy Sharmaz's constructivist approach, which attends to context and implicit meanings. And so what that really says is that I am not a blank slate in being a researcher. And that in interviewing the women and bringing in all the things I shared with you, the lens, the different conversations, all of those sort of pieces, that the interviewee and I are co-constructing data together. So it's not as though they're talking into a machine, but it's really sort of acknowledging the lens that I bring to this work, even though this is a very exploratory and trying to understand the things that naturally emerge from the process. What I also really like about this approach is that it really seeks to highlight the roles of social hierarchies and of power differentials. And if there's one thing that's really relevant in sex trafficking research and broadly, it's a lot about power, right? And so this method seemed really conducive to that. The method itself involves drawing of constant comparisons. So we collect data, we compare data to data, we compare codes to data, we compare codes to codes. And one thing that is a key piece of grounded theory approaches is the theoretical sampling. And so what that means is, you know, in Sharmaz's quote that I think is a nice summary is this: initial sampling in grounded theory is where you start, and I'll share with you where I started. Theoretical sampling directs where you want to go. So as things were emerging, and particularly as is relevant for this conversation, as themes were emerging about the experiences of racism that women were experiencing, about some of the challenges that providers had in addressing racism or their lack thereof in terms of their strategies and lack thereof, really sort of using that as a point to sample and to understand more, to get more data and to interview more people, to have further perspectives that can add to that picture or that model or that theory. You know, one example of this is that there was a hierarchy that emerged in terms of what type of sex trading the women were involved in, and that was a challenge in the services as women would talk about sex trading, right? There was a lot of judgment between them. And so that hierarchy, as it really emerged, it was really important for me to flush out those categories, right? To really understand that hierarchy. And so that would lead to further sampling. And in grounded theory, we collect data until we reach saturation, which is the process of no new emerging themes or no new themes emerging from the data. So people describe it differently. One way is that you can sort of predict what the answers will be. I kind of like that. That was helpful for me to understand. I think the other piece about saturation that sometimes gets talked about and sometimes doesn't is it's not necessarily that you've had no new occurring themes about every aspect, but it's about related to the model. That there's no new emerging theme. So one of the ways in which I think this is really relevant is in this study is that a few of the women who I interviewed identified as members of the LGBTQ community or really identified as lesbian or bisexual. And that would have been, that I think is a really important area of future research. It was something that as it emerged, it would have been an entirely new study altogether. And so I wasn't really able to reach saturation about those questions, about how sort of that piece of sexual orientation and the intersection perhaps with race, that's really important. But I think we did reach saturation about sort of the racial tensions experiences of racism. And then I think part of saturation is figuring out what is for future research. So to give you an idea of what the interview structure looked like, so I interviewed a total of 30 women. I conducted all the interviews myself. 24 of them were connected to services, to social services in some way. So they either were attending substance use treatment or they were attending a variety of different organizations that were connected to that coalition. So intimate partner violence services, sexual violence services, homeless youth type services for all adults, right? So more in that 18 to 24 bracket. But, you know, just to give you an idea, right? And part of what I really wanted to do was to capture the perspectives of women who were not connected to services. Because when I think about barriers of accessing services and engaging services, talking to women who are engaged in services is not enough, right? And so the way that I did that for this study is that I asked the women I interviewed if, in different words, if they knew someone who met that inclusion criteria, but who wasn't connected to social services at the time. So someone who was an adult woman who had traded sex as adults, but who was not connected to social services. Now, in a different world. So one of the other models of doing this type of research that I think is really, really cool is to do more of a drop-in center type model where someone comes in for the researcher, it's located in a particular community. People don't have to give their name, and can do an interview and then leave. That would likely get at more of the sort of less visible participants than I was able to do. Lauren Martin has some really excellent work if this is of interest to anyone on this. But I think that this, I think strengths and challenges. So I think that would have captured a different perspective as well. But I am glad that I was able to capture the perspectives of 6 women who were not connected to services, and 2 of those 6 had never been connected to any type of social service. I also interviewed 10 service providers, 20 service providers, excuse me. 10 of the service providers were connected in some way to the coalition. And so these were providers who were coming to the meetings and were involved in some way in the membership because they understood and knew that that sex trafficking was an issue in the community, right? Not to say that some of other providers who might have also been aware but not attended, that's certainly possible, but these were folks who were really actively involved. And then I asked them, to sort of paint me a picture of when they're working with someone who's at risk of sex trafficking or who has been involved in the sex trade as an adult, what are the other services or who else do they refer to? And so those providers made up another 10 interviews. As I mentioned, the Kate Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation, the coalition was really, really instrumental in helping me to, do an iterative process, which included the interview guide development. So in conjunction with them, we created 2 mirrored semi-structured interview guides to explore some of the questions, right? The women's interview guide used the life calendar method, which is essentially where you use on a piece of paper, you have this line, as you can see here, from birth until now, and you use it to write some very key elements or key things that have happened so that then you can sort of orient some of the questions that you're asking. So for example, someone would talk about the birth of a kid, for example, which is a very instrumental, right? Often you typically, hopefully, in a lot of cases, remember when your kid was born. And so then asking questions about, okay, so when did you go for substance use treatment? Was that before or after the kid was born, right? So to be able to kind of orient the interviewee. This is a method that's been used in a variety of different, with a variety of different populations, and so it felt appropriate and was a very helpful tool. I'm happy to answer questions about that if there are any. So this is just some of the nitty-gritty details. I think one of the strengths of this was having so many different spaces around town with different bus routes to have access to private office space to conduct interviews for women. I really left it up to them as to how they wanted to proceed. Service providers, I usually went to them. That was a lot easier. The only other thing I'd like to say here is that, of course, women's interviews tended to take longer. They were more emotionally difficult, probably for them, certainly for me. That there was much more time. I spent a lot more time on the informed consent process because it's a different scope of interview when you're talking about your personal experiences versus your work experiences, right? And so just wanting to really be cognizant about that. The data analysis process, so similar to this relationship with this group of providers this whole time, some of whom have lived experiences as well, I should mention. So we reviewed the data, 2 of us in our research team reviewed the data, and we conducted open coding, and then had a lot of conversations within the team, and then brought those conversations to this group of service providers as well. And so, we were able to really flush out some things, in terms of narrowing the focus, which often happens, right? Being able to sort of talk about that, et cetera. We were continuously, I mentioned that this method involves constant comparison. And so doing that with a group of people with a lot of different work experiences at the table. In retrospect, knowing what I know now about the themes that emerge having to do with race and racism, again, I think it would have been a really interesting piece to have stopped and to have said, let me think about if we need to bring in a different coder because of our racial identities as the coders, right? And so to bring in a more racially diverse group of coders, right? That would have been something that I think a lot about now when I think about the focus of studies, right? But that was not something that I did at the time. And then this process involved theoretical sorting, diagramming, and so this theory development that I've mentioned to you. One of the things that I think is really important about grounded theory development is that it places priority on the relationships. It looks at how and why participants construct meanings. And I think the fact that it's contextually situated in time, in place, in culture, in situation. And so part of me mentioning what year this was and the context in St. Louis is because this model is reflective in some way of the current time that it was happening. And so what's helpful is that these divisions and distinctions and hierarchies can become visible in some of that modeling. I took a number of steps to enhance that methodological rigor. So I think I talked about this already, right, in terms of reducing that, the most visible participants. Certainly more that could be done, but certainly using sort of that non-stigmatizing language. So never the word prostitute, and I even mentioned that word earlier. And I want to be clear that that's because that's what some women told me how they identified their experiences, right? That was never my word that I offered them. I think we talked about a lot of this. I do want to talk a little bit about self-reflexivity, and I'll talk more about that process at the end. But essentially, self-reflexivity, what that means is taking stock of actions in the role of research. So what was my role as the researcher with the lens that I have as a white person, as a person without lived experiences of sex trading? What was that role like in terms of creating the data and the model? There are two forms that I particularly paid attention to. Embodied self-reflexivity, which is the role of verbals and nonverbals. So this was audio recorded, but I could immediately after would sort of think a lot about, what might have my facial expressions have said. No way to know for sure, but certainly being aware throughout the interview and then afterwards, right, and sort of processing that. And then what could I pick up on the nonverbal communications? So some of that meant re-listening to audio and rereading of transcripts with that sort of lens of how did I contribute to this particular interview. And then relational, anybody who's been a service provider before and otherwise, quite frankly, some clients or participants are easier, or you fit better, or you relate better than others, right? And so what was that role, right? Not so much to deny it, very similar to clinical practice, not so much to deny it, but to sort of deconstruct what was happening and why. And then some other pieces to increase the transferability of findings, right? So thinking about what the contextual dynamics were, and then the increasing of confirmability and credibility. And so part of what is really important, I think, is member checking process. And I'll describe to you what I did. So I'm running a little bit behind on time. So essentially what we found is that, of course, women take their experiences that they have, just like I shared with you about my lens, they take their lens with them through their different experiences. And so that included into sex trading rather, in which they really identified themselves into three different groups. So there was the first group that talked about trading sex as just that. It was an action. They did not say, I identify as a sex trader necessarily, but they used it as an action, right? I traded sex and sort of some of the details involved there. Those women were different and had different experiences than those who identified as prostitutes. And again, they used that language, as well as those who identified as prostitutes with a pimp, where I, in hearing their stories, would have said sex trafficking, but that was not how they identified their experiences in the language they used. And it's important to mention that there was some fluidity between these different groups. So somebody might have experiences in 2 or 3 of the groups that I just mentioned. And so all of these experiences impact how somebody accesses services. And so some of the things that were really helpful were hearing client-centered language, feeling that services apply, things along those lines. Now, some of these clients were mandated to attend some of the services, but more often than not they weren't, or more often than not there was one mandated experience and then some others that were not mandated, right? And so someone, if those things didn't happen, might choose not to access services. So once somebody accessed that service, then there's the question of, do they stay engaged in it or disengage, right? And so we hopefully want to increase that engagement. And so the piece that I want to highlight here in relation to the findings that, you know, you may have read are this idea that feeling like these identities, including racial identities, particularly for Black and African American women, are acknowledged, right? And validated, right? As far as that's a piece. When that didn't really work well was with colorblind terminology. I don't really see color, that sort of concept. And then lacking acknowledgement of the role of racism in the different pieces that they've experienced. And so to summarize, like I said, the quotes are very rich in the articles, I think. But to summarize, there was this perceived preferential treatment for white women. There were these experiences of color blindness. You know, I don't see color. Well, then you don't see me, was one of the quotes that I remember very clearly. Experiences of racist name calling and racial tensions in group settings. And then as far as providers, like strategies to address some of this, sometimes there was no strategy. Sometimes the strategy was that they separated problem participants without kind of paying attention to the sort of core issues that were relevant here, having to do with that racism piece. Might say something like, you know, no name calling, we want to be respectful to each other, which again doesn't acknowledge the role of racism. Describing slavery's current impact. So we used to have slaves and therefore it's still relevant, and that's kind of the end of the conversation. And then there were some folks that were integrating anti-oppression groups where they would name sort of racism and privilege and oppression in sort of less academic-y type terms, but talking about it in terms of how that was relevant to their lives. And for the women who did participate in those, they talked about it being a very positive impact for their experiences. So as we got to this finding, it was really important to do member checking. So the purpose of member checking is to invite research participants to provide feedback on the interpretation of the findings, as well as the action steps. So all of the pieces that I just mentioned around integrating anti-oppression training, those were some of the things that we as the team felt were good next steps, but we wanted to sort of check in with the participants about what they thought. We had a lot of challenges in doing this, to be honest. The interviews took place the member checking took place 7 to 10 months after the data collection, or at least a bulk of the data collection. I had funding for food at that point, but I didn't really have funding to the way that I did compensate the women for their time. And as I mentioned, you know, if we had perhaps more team membership of folks with more lived experiences and more currently or more recent lived experiences, that might have also played a role. So for member checking, the community wanted sort of a general presentation with some of the research participants coming and being able to talk. So there was a mix of participants and other folks who hadn't participated in the study. And the responses were really generally confirmatory. Yeah, it's really hard to talk about race, for example, right? And you know, there's some differences too, I think, between the black providers and white providers in the room, but I can talk about that later. And you know, I think one of the other really helpful steps of doing that service provider check-in or member checking was also to think about helping to inform the member checking process for women. We were talking about a very sensitive subject. What about the group element, right, of having member checking with a group, right? Which is what we ended up doing. So our member checking for participants, you know, again, I interviewed 30 participants, 13 right off the bat I couldn't reach. Either their phones were disconnected or their voicemails was full, and so I couldn't leave a voicemail, and I kept calling a couple times, but never got through. Of the women who I reached, 6 said that they would come, and only 3 did. They all identified as Black women. So this is not ideal, of course, but it was still a very rich conversation that I'm really glad, even though there was low attendance, I'm glad that I was able to do that. So the results were the member checking was generally confirmatory. And part of what I think was interesting was just the ways that the women would talk to each other about their different experiences. So for example, you know, as we were talking about some of the racist name calling and all of that, they were talking about, oh yeah, I hear racist name calling all the time in social services. This is totally a problem, right? And so only one of the 3 women who attended the member checking had been to one of these kind of anti-oppression groups. And so she shared with the group that these groups actually work because I felt like I had to walk on eggshells around the white woman who used a lot of racist language. And I got to the point where I got tired of her and I actually put my hands on her. And I'm not going to run from some little white girl. So we did diversity class, and that's just what she thought. You have to be able to sit in your discomfort and be able to disagree. And so then this beautiful moment happened where, as this woman who has been through these groups is talking about her experience, the other two who haven't been through these anti-oppression groups are asking about, you know, the other woman about what her experiences was like, and sort of they're having a conversation about it. And one of the women who hadn't attended then said, you know, I would have loved to participate and not just shut up and learn how to survive, right? Talking it out and coming to some type of agreement, I think that would work. And so when we think about, you know, all the things that are happening for these women in terms of their own process of healing, to have some of these tensions, how can that be a helpful thing for their process, right? Which we all sort of want. And so then I think this process unfolded in terms of, we talked about the different discussion or action steps and what that would look like, and really worked with, because I was still working in that community, really working with folks to partner with different organizations that were local and to think about train the trainer, and how do we, you know, how do we trickle down all of this into all the different organizations. And, you know, this is something that really was a result of member checking, as well as the study in general. You know, there were a number of challenges that we faced in terms of implementing and evaluating, I think. And so in part because I then moved to Madison, where I am now, at some point in a time where Zoom culture was not really what it is now, because for better for worse of COVID. I think that, you know, now it would be sort of interesting to see what the connections between that community and I could look like without me physically having to go down there, which I think is just a different element for sure. So, you know, as I mentioned before, Deanna and Amanda wrote about their own reflections as well in that piece. But for me, you know, as a white Hispanic person looking the way that I look, I get a lot of questions about what I am. You know, things like, you're not white, are you mixed? And I've gotten them for a long time, but I also got them in this research study. So as I would talk about as I would interview the women, not really the service providers, but as I would interview the women and as we'd be talking about race, some of these questions would come up. And so this was part of really for me to reflect, right? I needed to do a little bit of what I did today, right? Being upfront about the fact that I have benefited a lot from white privilege. But I do get these questions and people don't quite know what to do with me some of the time. And so really analyzing that, among other pieces, is part of this reflexivity process. So I'm scrutinizing my own process for me as a white researcher, and really thinking about the roles of, you know, I interviewed white women, I interviewed Black women, you know, how were those different, right? Were there any patterns that emerged in terms of my own interview style? And then also in terms of that embodied and that relational reflexivity, right? Some of the relationships between. So an example of how I did this, you know, for example, there was one participant and her interview still sticks to my mind to this day. And one of the things, for example, that she wrote, where she said, was that, you know, all white girls, and I remember the way she looked at me at this point, get special privileges, and us N-words. I didn't repeat that word, but she did use that word. We come second. No matter where you look and no matter where you go, we're supposed to be subservient to your masters and our masters' children or their children's children. Slavery and racism aren't dead. And when she was telling me this, she emphasized, she looked at me very directly, and every time there was the your or you, she was very much pointing at me. And so part of my concern was, how did I react in that interview? You know, did I do something wrong? Let me think about my process. And so part of what I did was memoing and doing that immediate reaction. You know, to my knowledge, my facial expressions. I was very cognizant of the fact that I did not get defensive or did not, you know, try and say something that would be utterly unhelpful, such as, well, that's some white people, that's not me, right? Which I think we know that a lot of white people say, unfortunately, in some of those things, right? And that is just not the way that we need to do that. So I know I didn't do that, but, you know, still, what did I do in those moments, right? And so there was a rereading of transcripts and audio, and I think this is where this peer debriefing and support really comes in handy, because I had a group of people, some of whom were service providers in that area, some of whom were other colleagues and mentors. They were racially diverse, and I was able to be vulnerable with them, much as I hope I would do with a clinical supervisor when I was a practicing social worker, right? And really being able to work on my stuff and have those people with different identities, but also different experiences and work experience to be able to discuss this and deconstruct this and challenge me and ask me questions. Well, what were you feeling? What did you do? Do you know what your face did? Right. Was really, really, I think, really instrumental. And so I think for anyone kind of thinking about this kind of work and research, and I would argue for quantitative as well, not just qualitative, I think this is a very important piece of what needs to happen, particularly for white researchers. So my final thoughts, and then I hope that we can have a little bit of discussion. But my final thoughts is, you know, as I was preparing this conversation or this presentation, Sean Wilson's quote came from book, Research is Ceremony, Indigenous Research Methods. This quote came to mind as that research is all about unanswered questions, but it also reveals our unquestioned answers. And so I think about that in terms of coming back to that grounded theory model, situating it in time, in context, in culture, in situation, in racial dynamics, in power, in a white supremacist culture. How do we address some of those norms and those things that we haven't questioned yet? And how do we let that influence our research trajectories and ultimately how we translate research into practice? So thank you so much for your time, and I will go ahead and stop this screen so maybe we can see each other. But thank you so much for listening.
Lara, that was amazing. Thank you so much for giving us that presentation. It was incredibly inspiring for me and has made me think a lot about my own research practice. And so I'm really grateful to have been able to participate in this. We had a couple of questions from the audience that seemed like
Great.
sort of, rounding up kind of questions. So I save them to the end. For the sake of time, you guys who have put in comments, thank you so much, but I'm going to kind of quickly read them just so that we can hear Lara's voice as much as possible before we have to close. We'll probably go a couple minutes early over. If you have to go, we understand, but we'll keep talking for a few extra minutes. So stay on if you have the time. So this question comes from Leanne McCallum from the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force. And she asks, and who I will acknowledge is a partner in community-based research with me. So, so it's, I share her questions here. So, and she says, can you share some tips or guidance you have for researchers to create a project that has a diverse range of individuals conducting the research? For example, finding a diverse range of experience among coders, like you mentioned. Do you have any questions you suggest researchers ask themselves or resources you can share on that self-reflexivity bit and on diversifying the research team?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things that often comes up is that when hiring research assistants or coders or things along those lines, something that often comes up is what is their level of education? And I think that that in itself, given what we know about educational barrier or disparities, et cetera, can be a real barrier. And so one of the things that I try and think about now is, okay, what are the skills? What's the lens and what are the skills needed to conduct whatever level of analysis or be whatever part of this research project? What are the things that I can provide? You know, and I think at that point in my career, I wasn't super comfortable with the idea of doing a lot of training around coding. I wanted someone who had more experience around coding. I think as I advance in my career, I feel much more confident about the fact that I can teach somebody some of the skills needed to do qualitative coding, but I cannot bring their lens, right? And so I think that that's one of the key things to be thinking about. What are the key skills that that person needs? What are the key lenses and insights? And, you know, again, what I wish I would have done is as some of these themes were emerging and it became clear to me that this was going to be, that experiences of race and racism was going to play such a central role, then maybe that's the point where we stop and we take a look at the team and we say, okay, what do we need here, right? a lot of that, of course, depends on funding and sort of things that, but I think just in general, straightforward, I think that that's the key things that I am now bringing forward with me in terms of my qualitative projects in particular. In terms of, what are the skills that I can bring to them? What are the lenses that they need? And of course, every group, survivors, every racial group, every sexual orientation group is not a homogenous group either, right? And so really thinking about what is it, not just from the lens from their personal experience, but also maybe their professional experiences or experiences in community with other folks that we can draw upon for the particular project.
I'm really glad you've talked about that, because I was reading some materials on the Surge website actually the other day, and it was talking about sort of ways we've institutionalized white supremacy, and one of them is like a sense of urgency, and that sense of urgency often makes us think, I just want to get this out. This is such important stuff. Nobody's writing about race and trafficking. And so more important is for me to get this out than for me to slow this process down, train up a bunch of people. Like 2 people is enough by academic standards to have this coding meet my peer review guidelines or my peer review standards. And so, what's most beneficial for the most people is for me to get this out rather than to slow it down.
Yeah.
And so I'm really glad to hear you being reflective about how important it is to just go ahead and slow it down. I mean, what will it take? It's 30 interviews. You can, we can make this happen, right? But it's hard to justify that based on the strictures and the structures of academia. And I'm really glad to hear you talking about this. It's really helpful for me.
Yeah, and I am in a tenure track position. If I don't publish, it does not go well for me, right? And so I think about this a lot in terms of, and it's not just me. I think there is a more and more of a national dialogue happening around what is productivity and what does that mean? Right. Is it pumping out publications to get it out? And how does that, as you mentioned, relate to sort of these white supremacist tendencies? White supremacist tendencies are, there's perfectionism, which I think also in reflecting on my process, right? Perfectionism totally played a role in me sort of thinking, okay, well, I can check all the right steps, but how does that impact sort of the meat of what we, sorry for vegetarians, the sort of essence of what we're trying to accomplish, and thinking about, I think about that a lot as somebody who's on a tenure track of, this is really important for me to publish in these ways and to do these X, Y, and Z. And how does that relate to the questions that I'm asking and the methodological approaches that are required? So I think the good news is, to me, or the hope to me, is that I think this is becoming more of a conversation, not just project to project, but sort of institutionally of, what do we think, what is productive for universities? And I know, at University of Wisconsin, there's been some changes around different tenure tracks and things like that. And so, and again, that's just my world right now. But those pressures to get things out and things along those lines, I think that's a really relevant point.
I hope you're right. And I'm not seeing the movement happening fast enough, and so I'm hopeful that like Wisconsin and universities like them will lead the way on diversifying, or diversifying the way we understand what constitutes research productivity, and what constitutes sort of like even just a sense of what's appropriate skills and appropriate perspectives to be bringing to research. Because again, like we were saying about perfectionism, the drive is to have the most qualified, like to hire the most qualified person we can get for the budget we have to do that coding, right? And so we're thinking about the practice of coding, not the practice of doing the coding as a personal and perspectival kind of question. Right. And so our priorities are not in the right place. And so I think it's really useful. And one of the things I wondered when you were talking too was about community-based action research. And you're in social work, so I think there's a little bit more of a commitment to that kind of work than there is maybe across the academy or across research institutions. But I wondered about if you could talk a little bit, because I think about that community-based action research, because I think that a lot of people are hesitant to engage in it because they're going to be forced into uncomfortable conversations with people who do not share the same educational, ideological, and practical backgrounds that they have. They assume that's the case. Sometimes it's not the case, first of all. But also, second of all, you know, there's a sense that there is a priority and a privilege in having those backgrounds that allow those voices into the conversation and exclude others. And so I wonder if you could maybe address some of the challenges, which are there, but explain sort of how you look at those challenges and how you approach them to ensure that your I guess in some ways like your ethical approach to research, which I very much admire, is sort of followed.
Thank you. Yeah. I think not unlike how I hope I conduct myself as a teacher, or as an instructor, or, you know, in whatever the other pieces of my professional work and personal work, quite frankly, is the idea of we are going to sit in this conversation. And, you know, I think part of what my white privilege what I'm unlearning is that, you know, I'm going to get you to think that I'm right and that sort of idea versus we're going to sit and disagree with each other. And, you know, there is sort of this piece, on the one hand, there is this piece of let's try and understand each other and let's try and, you know, think about our different perspectives and integrate it. And then there's the other piece that I think is that if particularly white people or people in privileged, with privileged identities in general, depending on what the subject matter is, don't acknowledge that power differential, that lens, and shut up and listen, then I don't think we're really going to get anywhere in terms of moving forward the research trajectory. And, you know, I think about that a lot because I am a participant in these systems. I am a white professor and I, you know, hire people, right? And so, there is no way that if I try and hide from that and not be direct about that, right? I don't think that's
Everyone
else will know. Yeah, I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. And so, you know, I think about that now, you know, as I'm working on developing a survey for, you know, youth, for example, right now, and getting together a team of people, of youth with lived experiences, you know, to provide feedback and to compensate them from their time and things along those lines. And I think a lot about the conversations that I'm going to need to potentially have with them around, you know, them being I would imagine they would be rather distrustful of me, and they should be. We have not, you know, I mean, particularly white researchers, we don't have a great reputation. So, you know, I think acknowledging all of that and sort of coming at it, and what I think is hard, particularly with academic trajectories that often mean that you move different places, is I had years to develop relationships in St. Louis in a way that's different when I'm starting as a white researcher, right? And so versus starting as a social service provider, gaining relationships, I think white providers also have their stuff, right? But so I think that might not have actually answered your question, but I think but I think that, you know, sitting in those spaces and things like that. And then, you know, one of the other pieces that I think is the challenge about community engaged research is it community engaged? Is it community participatory? Is it action research? And being honest about what people are doing, right? So I did not, you know, I didn't have folks coding who were youth in, you know, for example, right? I mean, this wasn't a youth study, but if I were to have youth, for example, coding, that would be a different level of community involvement than sort of the process that I described to you today. And, you know, there's another version of this presentation where I try and sort of hide that and couch my language. And maybe I did that and I'm not aware of that, but, you know, I think that that's a piece too of what level of community engagement are we talking about? Why did we pick that particular level of community engagement? There may be lots of factors that are related, and then acknowledging that, you know, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing, this is what we're not doing, this is what you know, and sort of what we can learn from that.
Yeah. I wonder, you know, a question that Hani asked, and it's possible that Hani may have had to go to another call, but one question she asked was essentially, is this also true for quantitative research, and how does that work? What can you say about that?
Yeah, I think this is a very debated question. I think that this idea of lens and how we pose questions and how our lens and our experiences influences the questions we ask. I mean, that has totally applied to my survey research that I'm about to do, or in the process of doing, as it did to some of the qualitative work that I'm doing. I think we don't talk about it as much. I haven't, certainly, at least maybe from what I have read, we don't write about it, read about it as much in quantitative research. I think sometimes we look to quantitative research to be free of bias, but I think we've established that because of, in this case, white supremacy, white privilege infiltrating all of our systems, there is no way that didn't impact, that these norms don't impact the research that we do of any sort, right? There's an argument to be made around, okay, well, there are some instruments, for example, that are validated, but still, with which communities are they validated with? I think there's still a lot of areas in which...
And who does the validation?
And who does the validation, exactly. So I think that, I would argue that I think that this process is really relevant for researchers, regardless of what type of research that you do, as, you're sort of crafting all of this. But I don't think that as a field, that's where we are in thinking about quantitative versus qualitative. And I think we also we think about qualitative, there's a question within qualitative around subjectivity, objectivity. There's lots of different debates, the use of two coders in general, right? There's lots of different debates there. We don't have those debates in quantitative as much, but we do sort of look to quantitative to be more objective, and qualitative, I'm talking in broad strokes here, but qualitative to be more subjective. And I think there's pushback on that, but I think that that's been sort of the guidelines for a while. And so it's really exciting to me that we're starting as a community of researchers to think about this a little bit more in general, in terms of our systems.
So I have two more questions. One is about research, and one is about like practical applications of the research you just talked to us about. So one is about my face. So I was interested in you talking about like how your face is emoting, and I was thinking about that particular example that you were using about somebody getting to the point where they're saying like, this is how race relations work today, and this hasn't changed enough. And I suspect that my facial expression in that moment would not have been one of offense or fear or defensiveness, but one of like, yes, that is exactly what I want to be. This is like this. So this is one of the things I'm interested in hearing more about as you think about how you embody your research in a way, your research practice.
Yeah.
How, like, what, is there an ideal face? But also, or facial expression. But, I suspect that most of my facial expressions, especially when people say things that are controversial or things that are particularly exciting or quotable, is one of like, tell me more, like very excited. This is exactly what I want to hear. And I that's also influencing the speaker, even if it's affirming and not defensive or negative. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about like that way of carrying yourself while conducting interviews.
Yeah. And, I think there is a natural tendency for some, perhaps you, I think myself as well, to sort of err on the side of, the excitement, right? The sort of tell me more really excitement.
And I'm always like that anyway. So my face is
yeah. And, I don't think, I think in terms of really sort of eliciting the most authentic data from, because it's data, right? It's not a client relationship. And I think that was part of my sort of transition to researcher where I don't really see clients anymore. But so, for me, what I think about with my face is I am interested in what you're saying and I want to know more. And I try, not always successful, but I try and not go to, yes, tell me more about that. I really want to know more. And then similarly, and I think that I think because I've read so much and sort of thought so much about, don't be defensive, right? This isn't about you. I think that there's a tendency to sort of sway to the other side.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, you know, what I strive for anyway is, you know, this, please tell me more. I'm very interested in what you're saying. You know, that's a really interesting point. I want to understand more.
Yeah.
I try not to, you know, affirm to the point of, like I just said, like, yes, please tell me more.
Right.
Yes, this is so good, but I'm not always successful, I'll be honest.
Yeah.
I get really excited by data. And so sometimes
Yes.
it's, you know, um,
Yeah.
and so I think that that's a challenge for
Yeah.
qualitative researchers for sure, particularly from
Yeah.
expressive people that I'm gathering
Right.
you are.
Right. Right.
As
And you're so
well.
used to being in the classroom where you kind of are trying to create a dynamic
Yes.
expression to keep people engaged, and affirm people's experiences and their thoughts. So it's an
Yes.
interesting transition, and it's one I think about a lot too. So I'm really glad to hear you thinking and talking
It's a
about
good
it.
point.
So my last question also comes from Hani. She says she wonders what advice you'd give to survivors who are considering participating in a qualitative research study.
Yeah.
Are there red flags for researchers, of like things they should steer clear of? Should they
Yeah.
participate in things? How do they know it's a legit study? I
Yeah.
think that's interesting.
Yes, I didn't talk about that at all. So please, thank you, Hani, for asking that question. You know, I think, so a couple things. So for human subjects, you know, at a bare minimum, there's a lot of questions that, at least my experience has been, that they want to really make sure that you know what you're doing roughly, when you are asking questions, particularly of people with lived experiences. And so, you know, part of my human subjects application was, you know, talking a little bit about my clinical training, but also, you know, resources that were available to me, right, and people that I could, you know, contact, having a resource list. But also, I think this is not human subjects, but for me, what was really helpful is actually having a particular person or people to be able to contact in case someone gets triggered or something along those lines. And that did happen. I think I wrote about that a little bit in in the methods article. But you know, there was someone who arrived early to the interview, and she was really, to use her words, like creeped out by the building. And you know, I mean, I think I broke a hands-free law, so I wouldn't really recommend doing that. But I stayed on the phone with her as I got myself to the building, and just, you know, of course, I said, you know, do you want to leave? Do you want to come back? Like, you know, sort of asking some of those different options. But she said she wanted to stay. And so, you know, I sort of was trying my best to sort of talk and, you know, sort of make her, to the extent that I could, feel at ease, which also meant asking her, you know, like, where are you sitting in the room? You know, there's a door here, there's a window here, because some survivors don't like having their trauma survivors broadly don't like having their backs to the door. So really sort of knowing all of those trauma-informed approaches, I think, can be very, very helpful. I think the informed consent process is so important in terms of, I mean, it's pretty, if we think about a trauma-informed approach, right, part of that is to make sure that the person knows, you know, what the interview is going to look like, what, you know, that they can stop at any point for sure, but what types of questions are going to be asked and what sort of memories and experiences. And so, you know, I think I alluded to this. I spend a ton more time on informed consent for participants as I do with, than I do with people talking about their professional experiences, which that can be triggering too. But, and honestly, sometimes that's at a not detriment, but that's at a loss of our interview time. Because, you know, if I tell them it's going to take about an hour and we take a, you know, a long time, as you may have remembered, like some of those interviews took till 90 minutes sort of total, right? And so I might have to cut that interview short, and I think that that's okay. And then, so I think sort of that informed consent process, being very available to, you know, providers, to people before and after, right? So that, you know, I mean, and there's a boundary setting process as well, right? I'm not going to be seeing you on a regular basis, but, you know, here's my number if there are things that come up that you know, want to sort of figure out what your next steps are, right? And I can think about referral to services. And then, you know, I think one of those calls resulted in, or for a different participant, you know, who got very triggered by an assault that she had experienced that she ended up telling me about. You know, we stopped the interview and we had a long conversation about, you know, what support she was needing. And we then I ended up calling myself with her per her, you know, what would you like to do? You know, there's a resource here. Like, would you like us to call together? You know, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And so per her, what she wanted, we ended up calling together and getting an appointment and sort of going through that process and talking about what her plan was after she left here and how she was going to take care of herself and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think all those things are really important if we're asking about lived experiences. And sometimes I think there's an overlap between, you know, those interviewing professionals about their professional experience, which sometimes also can include personal as well.
I think these are really good tips for like vetting any survey that you might, or any study you might participate in for any of us, but particularly for survivors who are often you know, increasingly asked to participate in studies these days, because there's an increasing number of researchers. But I also think that the items you listed, informed consent, referral list for resources for counseling if there's re-traumatization, also having a group that vouches for you in making the connections often.
Yes.
I thought about that as you were talking.
I forgot about that piece too, but yes,
and really focusing,
people's buy-in was very important in terms of somebody going to somebody and being like, hey, I saw this flyer, who is this person? And
right,
you know,
can I trust this person?
Exactly. And you know, providers not saying like, yes, do the study, but you know, I've met her, you know, whatever, and sort of things along those lines. And also the snowball sampling for other women too, right? Yeah, I went through this interview, this is what it was like, right? I envisioned those conversations happened.
Yeah, and using that informed consent process as a way of building rapport and trust, and like setting up the terms of like what your responsibility is to them. You know, it's a reciprocal engagement in some ways.
Absolutely.
Like you are willing to assist them, and what, you know, if something were to come up. These are important tips to mention, I think, because they're fairly standard among social science researchers. But if you're somebody out there who's in our audience or among our participants in the network who's interested in doing research, but you're not affiliated with a university, these are things you can do on your own to sort of guide your ethical practice in research, to create a structure around your practice of research that is that makes it more you know, just more trustable is trustable word? For trustworthy for people who might participate in your studies. And so I think that these things are really great tips on both sides. So I have a whole page of questions, and you and I can talk for, I hope, the rest of our professional lives together. So I'm really grateful to you for your time and for the work you're doing and for the thought you're putting into, like in a lot of ways, shifting the paradigms for human trafficking research. I'm really happy to see this happening. I'm also grateful to all of you who participated, who are still on the call, and those of you who had to go as well. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us. I think that you have a slide with your...
I did, yes. And I'm assuming the slides will go out at some point. But,
yes. And we will be posting this presentation to our website within the next couple of weeks, and we'll post it to the listserv so that you know it's there. And so please feel free to share with others and to be in touch with us. I'm so thrilled to have been able to be a part of this.
Thank you so much for, you know, everyone for your time, and thank you for your flexibility in going over. I'm truly grateful. And yes, and I think my email is copied on the reminder about today's webinar. And so, you know, I'd be happy to talk about anything else that might be helpful. So thank you so much for inviting me.
And someone asked if you can share a standard informed consent form. And so maybe if you want to send me something like that, we can attach it to the materials for...
Yeah, although I will say that a lot of what's involved in like the informed consent is often, I think, templates for the university, right? And so, you know, I think for me, there's more cues around sort of verbal, right? Like, so here, let's talk about this, you know, when it comes to risks and benefits, right? So there's language in there, but I think a lot of that is fairly template. I think I use that as sort of a conversation point, and like you talked about that as a rapport building piece, because my experience with IRB is that they like the templates, right? So.
But I think we can probably get you Alexa, we can probably get you something that's kind of standard to build from.
Absolutely, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much.